This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with hosts Ben Pratt. Thanks for joining us.
Very much about staying in fifth gear, trying not to have huge swings up and down in your watts, trying to have consistent watts. And that's why you'll see when Froome's attacked on mountains, he doesn't respond. He sort of, okay, I hold point A to point B. The fastest I can get there is most constant. We actually started the season still 20 watts ahead of where we were last season, but 20 watts down from months before. And we sort of looked at each other and said, it's the strength training.
And welcome to another Fit to Succeed podcast. I have with me a guest from my past. He's a colleague called Phil Mansfield, who's now working as a conditioning coach over in Denmark. Phil, it's great to have you with us today.
Nice to be here, Ben. Thanks for inviting me on. Good to see you again.
And you, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Now, I'm going to kind of get straight into it with you today because we have a lot of content to cover and I'd really love to pick your expert brain. Right, so as a former rugby player and strength conditioning coach, Phil, can you let me know what it was that motivated you to completely change direction? Because now in Denmark, you're working as an endurance cycling coach. You help people in running, triathlon, and even with some CrossFit. So what caused you to change direction in your career?
Yeah, I think the scar rugby cut quite deep. I was forced out of rugby rather than it was a conscious decision. So I think the injuries that I sustained and the doctors, putting an end to my career there sort of left me needing to move away from anything that sort of smelt like rugby, if you like. It was pure sort of psychological and the drive to be fit and the drive to train and look after my body was always there, but it had to be something that was sort of the polar opposite from rugby, to be honest.
Obviously, switching from rugby, which is a power and sprint-based sport, you've moved towards a endurance-oriented sport. Now, considering the skill set you had, did that require some retraining on your side?
Oh, massively. And in all fairness, it's probably why. I mean, of course, success is relative to the person or to the outcome or the goals of the person. But it was why I struggled with success in the really long distance. I mean, it ended with. I think I've run upwards of 30 marathons and 7 Ironman and
wow.
And really went into it quite deep and loved it. But I mean, it depends. I was very much middle of the road and those sprint fibers. I mean, still now none of even the pros that I'm coaching can beat me over 150, 200 meters. There, I'm still the fastest, and if I choose the session, it's always sort of 10 by 200 or 10 by 300. But the last 2 or 3 hours of an Ironman were always very, very difficult for me. And as much psychological conditioning as physical conditioning, I had to sort of learn to pace myself and learn to work in, as a sprinter, you tend to work in sort of the first or fifth gear. You tend to work in all out or rest and learning the second and the third gears and how to use those gears appropriately if you're going uphill or downhill was a thoroughly enjoyable learning curve more so than the results from the triathlon.
Okay, and so you've had to kind of retrain physically yourself to become more familiar with that, and that sounds like, wow, you've done a lot of endurance stuff over the years, but also, did you have to go through, in terms of becoming a coach for those people, did you go through much change in terms of the training that you felt you needed to do in order to be able to coach others successfully?
Yeah, I mean, very, very much so. I think we tend to be able to use sports to culture within sports tends to set boundaries and limits on us. And I think when I meet guys from the rugby world, I often think, if only you could see what I can see from the endurance world, you could improve so much, and vice versa, what I could bring from the sprint world over. And I think there's a lot of things that culture in sport says we can't do, but the sport next door is doing exactly that. And having that crossover was a huge benefit. So I think I was one of the first guys to say, look, strength training, short conditioning, off-bike work or outside of run work or dry land work is just as important as the actual conditioning in swim, bike, run, and at the same time, then of course the knowledge set and the studying to understand what happens after 4 hours and how do we produce power, because power is in absolute power over 10 seconds is very different to power after 4 hours of racing. They might both be a sprint, but they're very different mechanisms, very different fuel sources, very different timings, and just being able to understand the effect the volume has on the system and the different stresses that occur was a long process. It's thoroughly enjoyable and exciting one to learn, but took a lot of time, and was lucky enough to almost jump straight in and work at the top end of the sport, and get the opportunity to work with some of the best in the world at that time was a very steep learning curve, but one that was worth it. I mean, they had the fundamental knowledge from what they've been doing all the time anyway, if that makes sense. So what it was for me, it was looking like how can we apply knowledge from other sports or from other backgrounds into that existing knowledge. I mean, how people have been winning bike races for years, so there's sort of a fundamental science there that exists. And I think where we came in, or where I came in, was to say, okay, what can I add to this from other sporting backgrounds?
I kind of really like that concept that there is crossover even when we're working on, almost polar opposite sports. Would you be able to give because you mentioned there about you felt that one sport could really benefit by seeing what the other does and vice versa, even though they look like they're on the opposite end of the energy system spectrum. Can you give an example of one thing where you've seen that there's more crossover than people might realize in terms of training?
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing is if you take CrossFit and cycling, for example, you would sort of look at them and think they're polar opposites. And the benefits we're seeing from our CrossFit athletes from having an aerobic base, a lot of those guys are hitting their max heart rates very early and being able to work at 90 to 94% capacity. The cyclists can sit at, if they're doing a time trial for an hour, and they'll sit at 92, 93% capacity for an hour. And their drop-off rates between, if you imagine, it's very difficult without drawing it, but if you imagine a sort of X and Y axis, the cyclists have a much straighter Y axis, where the sprinters, they go down and they fall very quickly off.
They lose power quickly.
They lose power quickly. So being able to take the cyclist thresholds to a new level, there's longer to the top. Like, they struggle actually between 93% and 100. Wow. They can hold 93% all day, but going to 95, 96%, they've got maybe 2-3 times, and we call it in cycling, we call it burning your candles. You've got three matches, and once you've burnt your 3 matches, you don't come back. So they can hold 95% for 3-4 hours, but they hit 97% 3 times, and they're gone. So actually giving them the ability to have repeatable power is an enormous benefit on that power volume curve. And conversely, with the CrossFitters, having them the ability they can work at 70% or 98%, giving them the ability to be able to hold 90, 95% for longer periods of time has really, really made a huge difference in their performance.
I bet. That's fascinating. I hadn't realized that people were training at quite that level of capacity, up in the 90s. Certainly research that I've read, usually scientific studies on cycling tend to be around sort of the 70 to 85% VO2 max mark. So, I mean, you're seeing cyclists pushing harder than that?
Well, when I'm talking 90, 92%, I'm talking about max capacity over that time.
Right.
So if their best hour watts was 340, they can sit at 320. If you do what I mean, 100%, rather than it being a percentage of VO2 max. Yeah,
I'm with you. I'm just thinking too much with a scientific bias here. I should listen to the coach.
No, everything in cycling is watts based.
I get you, because it's the power output, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. Of course. I mean, you can transfer that to sort of a fitness environment and say if your 1 rep max squat was 100%. These guys can work at 100 kilos. 100% is 100 kilos. You could work at the capacity to work at 92, 93 kilos is very, very good in a cyclist. where their 1 rep max wouldn't be that high, but you just come off max and they've got massive repeatability there.
Oh wow, yeah, that's impressive.
Whereas you take the CrossFitters, their 1 rep max might be 140. But if you take them to 92 kilos against the cyclist and say, right, who can do the most reps, the cyclist will win. So giving the cyclist the ability to have a higher 1 rep max and then giving the CrossFitters the ability to repeat 90 kilos many, many times is where the two sports sort of combine very nicely.
So that's really fascinating, that the way that you've kind of mapped that out to see how the two sporting individuals can compare. That's a because I would say typically we never really compare them in terms of size or body weight or performance because we expect them to perform differently.
Yeah, but I think we can learn a lot from different sports there. I mean, we have a session on Wednesday nights. I have an open session for the athletes that I coach, and we do something there called cycle strength. And that would typically involve a 6-minute interval on the bike and then a 6-minute strength-based routine, and we'll run that between 4 and 6 times backwards and forwards. And there you'll see the CrossFitters will jump off the bike completely sort of up to here, and then hit the, overhead squats or walking lunges or whatever it may be and start to get comfortable, where the cyclists are sitting with 110 cadence and 300 watts in a conversational, and they'll get off the bike and then they'll look over and the CrossFitters are, really going for it, and the cyclists are like, and then just having them pushing each other in their respective environments has been really good for performance. We've really seen the difference.
I can really see how that, it seems like an opposite group to have training together, but actually, like you said, they help to push each other through their weaker side. Yeah, fantastic. I love that. So let's just step back a little bit for the benefit of the listeners. What would you say are the primary athletic factors that would determine success in an endurance cycling event? What is it you're trying to develop in an endurance cyclist?
Well, I think to be a little technical in terms of cycling, Ben, I think it's very, very important we talk about which type of cyclist we're discussing. There's a long way between a Chris Froome tour, sort of grand tour rider, to a one-day classics rider, to a time trial specialist, to a track rider. They're classified under cycling, but essentially they're 4 different sports.
How about if we compare the two opposites and create a contrast? So let's look at the long-term distance cyclers, the Chris Froomes, versus your velodrome cyclists, who are doing sort of 1K sprints. Let's look at the two opposites and give me some idea.
Well, I mean, an endurance racer in terms of Chris Froome and those guys, they're a lot like the triathlon or the time trial guys. They're trying to, I think the best way to describe those guys is if you're talking about fuel consumption in a car. So if I drive in the city and I'm changing gears very often, I'll burn fuel at a greater rate than if I'm on the motorway in gear 5 and being sort of at a constant speed. And so those guys are very much their training is based on fuel consumption and energy consumption. So rather than how much am I using, how much am I not using? So in that respect there, it's very much about staying in 5th gear, trying not to have huge swings up and down in your watts, trying to have consistent watts. And that's why you'll see when Froome's attacked on mountains, he doesn't respond. He sort of, I hold point A to point B, the fastest I can get there is most constant. So instead of having these swings, I might get there in the same speed, but I would have used a lot more energy as a car would, going from 1st to 3rd to 4th back to 1st. So in that respect there, it's very much about training the discipline and training the mind to be as disciplined as possible and look at your watts and have control. Where on the other end of the spectrum, there you're talking about how many times can I go up and down? And there you have exactly that high fuel consumption, high sugar consumption, and even in terms of what we necessarily do nutrition now, but even in terms of what the guys eat are very different. We tend to avoid the gels, the high sugar stuff for the Chris Froome example, because we don't want that spike. Yeah, whereas the velodrome guys or the one-day racers that are sort of sprinting and stopping there I wouldn't say one-day racing or velodrome, I wouldn't classify that as an endurance sport. I would classify that as a power endurance sport, as in how many times can you produce a high, near maximal amount of power recover and go again, rather than holding that constant sort of marathon running or triathlon or Ironman or cycling is very grouped together in the sort of tour cycling. It's very grouped together in that endurance side where it is consistent output, where the one-day racing or the velodrome cycling is closer to football than cycling, actually, in terms of it's a sprint and a stop, sprint and a stop, sprint and a stop. And that's why you tend not to see the crossover. You tend not to see these guys doing very well over here or these guys doing very well over on this side of the fence.
I'm with you. I really like that analogy of fuel consumption and gear changing. It makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider the velodrome guys often have to do rounds to get to their semis and finals. And so, like you said, it is this battle of max out, recover, get back to ready to max out again. Whereas I find it intriguing, though, that this idea of endurance being trying to be as efficient at your top end endurance capacity without fluctuation.
Yeah,
that must be a challenge when someone's actually out on the course, when there is changes in hills and undulations to deal with. How do they try to? What strategies would you use to prevent them, overexerting their power output or dropping down too low when they're working with the terrain?
Well, I think that that's why Chris Froome has come in for a lot of criticism the last many years from what you would call the old guard of cycling, in terms of that he's been called boring and he's made cycling boring, and the old days where they were just attacking each other from left and right and there were sprints and everything else, where he's going. That's why I think from a scientific point of view, he's made cycling very, very exciting if you understand his processes that he's going through. And as you rightly alluded to, the discipline it takes to be able to do that. I think what we do with our guys is we always ride with a Garmin or some kind of cycle computer where you can see, you've maybe got 12, 15 data fields in front of you where the whole time you can see your left leg watts, your right leg watts, your heart rate comparisons. You can have that's live data. Yeah. And so initially with the guys, what we'll do is we'll set it up so you've got 3-second watts and the lap average watts. So we'll say, okay, for the next 20 minutes, I would like you to average 300 just to pick a number. And then the 3-second watts at the top should always be relative as close to 300. So in a perfect world, we never go over 310 or under 290. And then we'll let them, so they come to a mountain, and when it goes up, it has to go down. Mm-hmm. So it's maybe sitting with 350 up because you're only going to be sitting with 130 down because it's difficult to push the watts there. And so you're looking at trying to test them in as you say, multiple terrain, and see if they can get that average. And then sitting down with them after and data analysis says, where are we? How well did we do that today? And we measure that with the variability index that says you were so efficient today. Your efficiency score was, under 5%, we usually say is a good day, and over 5% is where we then work with the athlete on being more efficient in that. So it's all data tracked, and for the new beginner cyclist who's listening who all that sounds a lot, you can just use heart rate and say for the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to hold an average of 145 heart rate. So you have two data fields. One is average, one is current, and if it's under 145, go a little bit over your average. And if it's over 145, come a little bit under, and literally just play with coming home after 20 minutes, having 145 average is how we.
So you're kind of tracking where your average heart rate is, and as you see it drop or rise, you adjust your output to get it back.
Exactly. And so downhill, of course, you'll be going faster because it's harder to work harder, and going uphill is actually, you feel like you're going quite slow. I remember I had a coach and athlete that was second in the national championships here. I think 2012 it was, and he was a master of it, an absolute master. His watts varied very, very little, and he had 403 watts, which I don't know if you know much about cycling. We had 403 watts over 50 minutes. Which is, it was a lot. And he was second. He lost the championship by 1 second, and we were in the car.
Got it.
And his sports director there in the car was sort of angry as anything, because going uphill, he just nice and easy, he just pushed up, and as soon as he hit the top, it was ching ching down the gears, and he went again, and if you're not better than your max over an hour, if that makes sense. If 400 is your capacity for an hour, it doesn't matter which way round you do it. You can't ride more than 400 in the hour. So being efficient with that, you might as well have that in the motorway rather than that, because then your average will be 390, for example.
I'm with you. Yeah.
So I can just remember being in the car and the sports director screaming out the window and screaming in the microphone and, "What are you doing? Speed up, come on. And then saying, "Look, calm down. He knows what he's doing. He's all under control." And lo and behold, his average was perfect at the end.
Yeah, amazing. Got it to lose by a second, but I guess if he's done as much as he could possibly do, then that's still a great performance.
Yeah, the target was 400 and he hit 403. So
can't fault it, eh?
So.
Right, so we've talked quite a bit there about, I guess, ways to measure, to track, to seek out average data, all fascinating. How about we just dial back a bit and look at, you have one of your athletes come in as an endurance cyclist. What would a typical evening training session look like?
Evening training session?
Morning, evening, I don't know. A typical session. I'm assuming people work, I guess.
Well, to be honest, the majority of my guys don't. Majority is predominantly professionals, but I mean, the average cycle, again, as you know me, Ben, I'm very much into periodization and planning, so it would very much depend on the time of year and where we're headed and what we're doing would very much be. But the typical session would be warm up, and then the intervals will vary very much on the focus period, and the intervals will be very much based on the spectrum we talked about before. Are they a dominant towards their the sprint side or the more endurance side? I'm very much a believer in people peak and top with that their best at. So the analysis of the rider will be the first, as in what type of rider have I got, see if I can categorize them to a more sort of durable, that we talked about, the guys that can hold high capacity for long times, or the guys who are sort of sprinters. And then try to, during the winter months and the build-up phases, work on the weaknesses and as race time and race time, try to simulate the race through their strengths.
If we give that some context to try and get a better answer, because I haven't asked the greatest question there. Let's say the person they've done their foundation period in the season, they've established their aerobic base, and they're now in that transition phase where they're trying to prepare, for their taper, and they're transitioning towards competition. My limited knowledge would suggest that this person's looking to increase the pace that they can hold their maximum speeds at. What would that type of a session look like?
Yeah, cycling is one of the classic cycling intervals is something called 40-20s, where you sprint for 40 seconds, rest for 20 seconds, and that stimulates the turnaround. As they sit and they turn in and out of the wind and they roll around each other. So that simulates that you have sort of a 40-second effort up at the front, and then you take off and let the others take over. So very much do sort of like a 40-20.
So that's cycling as a team. So when there's a team cycle and they're trying to draft each other, is that what you're referring to?
Well, not necessarily as a team. They'll always be sitting on somebody's wheel anyway. When you get a breakaway. And most racing is about getting into the breakaway. So being in the breakaway, you'll probably have 6 guys from different teams, but they have the interest of working together at the start to get away. So we try to simulate that quite a lot.
I see.
We called it race simulation phase. The phase you're alluding to there, we called it a race simulation phase, and there we'll typically look at the race coming up and try to replicate that as best as possible in chunks during training. One session we really enjoyed doing is we'll take the average watts we think they're going to have in the race, and then we'll ride 20 minutes at those watts with every 1 minute 50 a 10-second sprint a little bit over the watts, just to simulate the tempo changes and the pace changes of the race. We can do sort of watts ladders, where you'll sort of go up every minute, up a ladder and down the other side, a sort of pyramid or a ladder base change watts every minute. We quite like to use cadence as a tool, so do some hill repeats with 60 cadence to 120 cadence to sort of...
Do you mean RPMs, or is there a different way of measuring that?
No, cadence RPM, yes. Yeah, exactly. So the first hill we'll take with 60 sitting down, and then we'll sort of turn around and come down, and then the next one we'll take with plus 100 standing, and try to just sort of, when you're sitting, you're training more sitting. With a low cadence, you're training more of a strength system. With the standing high cadence, you put more lung capacity. It's typical, would be a typical sort of race simulation session. We'd play with the cadences, we'd play with the changing more. I think the way to say it best is more simulating the race in terms of changing the terrains, changing the intervals, and being very varied in what we're doing. Whereas the base phase that's very quality based. It's very focusing on one thing and getting one thing right. Where the race simulation is sort of trying to prepare for all the eventualities that could be thrown upon you during a race.
Right, I see. That's fascinating how you're trying to use replication of real life scenarios as well as almost, when you're looking like that pyramid concept, it sounds very similar to doing a weighted pyramid, if you're in the gym, but you're just applying it on a bicycle instead.
It's another example of how we can cross over with sports. I mean, cycling, when I came into cycling, we got out on our bike in the mornings, we rode for 4 hours. We did something called a medium, which is pretty much a waste of time. But it's still very popular. You go out and you do 4 times 10-minute medium, which means you do 4 times 10 minutes, which is just a little bit harder than nothing. And then you come home again, and that was training. And then you go out on Saturday and race, and its tempo changes and up and down and ins and outs, and 20 minutes at nearly max capacity, and then you have 10 minutes where you're perhaps down in the peloton. And it has sort of very little, if no, carryover to racing, but it's we did it in the 80s, so it's good enough for us in the 80s, so it's good enough for us now sort of attitude.
Right. Sounds like it was just a mileage activity. Get some mileage in your legs.
Pretty much, that was it, and it was unfortunately, and as I say, now being able to blend sports and see what they're doing and taking science from lots of. I'm fortunate enough to have coached at a sort of top level across, perhaps 7 or 8 sports, and being able to take those knowledge with me and say, okay, it's okay to sprint on your bike, and it is okay to change the watts up and down and do some simulation.
I think that leads really nicely to we're getting close to time, but it leads really nicely to kind of the last sort of thought process, which, clearly if you're training as a road cyclist, it's important to do lots of the endurance work, and you're going to do a lot of bike focused work. But what role does off the bike training play, in the gym, mobility work? I also know that you've done a lot in that field as well. How do you integrate off the bike training with your cyclist athletes?
Yeah, I think almost I'd go as far to say as it's especially with my guys, is it's become our discipline. It's as important as the bike training. So, I mean, if we divide that into 2 sides, we divide it into a sustainability side, in that these guys are sitting in one position for 4 hours, 5 hours at a time. I mean, you sit in your chair for 5 hours, you stand up, it's stiff, your back's stiff and everything else. So these guys are sitting almost still, very little movement in the upper body and the lower back and the hips for many, many hours at a time. So just from a pure sustainability standpoint, having the flexibility and the strength and the body control to be able to do that is crucial. Being able to sit in the position. The other side of it is like we know from all other sports, is force production. Is teaching the body to produce more force. It's an interesting story. 2010, 2011, as I started working in elite cycling, I began to do strength training in the winter with them, and we had we came to loggerheads there where we don't do strength training on season because cyclists are very, very scared of putting any weight on. It's very, very weight. So I got the okay to do some kind of strength training in the winter, but as soon as we hit 1st of March, we had to stop, and we hadn't gone into our race simulation phase yet. And the race simulation phase is when the real watts are supposed to come. And they were all 20, 30, 40 watts ahead of where they usually are at that time of the year, because we've been doing the strength training. But at that point, we didn't attribute it to the strength training. So then we started our race simulation phase, where you actually should put watts on. And everyone was really excited because we're 40 watts ahead this year. We've just got Phil as our coach. We're 40 watts ahead. It's going really well. And now we put the watts on, and actually as we started to put the watts on, we started to lose the watts. We started to go down. Wow. So we actually started the season still 20 watts ahead of where we were last season, but 20 watts down from months before. Wow. And we sort of looked at each other and said, it's the strength training. You know, it's the strength training that does it, and as a result of that, now we follow strength training all year round. I tried
longer term. Have you seen that make a bigger difference for the athletes?
I mean, one of the big differences when guys start with us, because strength training is still very, very much forbidden in cycling and triathlon in the sort of in a wider spectrum. There's not many coaches who have, unfortunately, there are some, but there's not many coaches who have accepted this. And what we see is a new athlete comes in and starts with us, and they start in the strength training process, and very, very quickly we see that boost and we see that improvement. And we do very, very much, we try again to replicate the sport. So we have something called the 1,000 Club, which is 1,000 walking lunges. And I wouldn't recommend it for any. If you're listening, don't.
Sounds brutal.
Don't do it. But for someone who's racing for 4 hours at a time, that sort of force production capacity rather than maximal force is just a little bit harder than a hard interval with a lower lung capacity. So the skill of the movement's perhaps higher, but the lung capacity is a little bit lower, and stuff like that is. I mean, we'll do 10 minutes biking at a medium intensity with 250 walking lunges times 4, for example, as a That's
a tough session.
Sorry.
Unpleasant.
Yeah.
The lactate must be awful.
So I mean, that's a sort of typical how we're crossing over with endurance training and cycling. So it still looks a little bit like cycling, or it still has that endurance capacity, just a little bit of a greater force production.
I love that. I love that you're taking things that actually in the mainstream cycling world are seen as potentially counterproductive, but you're kind of disproving that and showing that they can still be a valid part of the training process. It does lead me to one kind of final question on this topic, and that is, as you are kind of pushing people on both fronts, you're pushing them on the bike and trying to build their watts during this transition period, but you're maintaining the strength training, which is kind of seems like it's against the normal training. What measures do you take to try and prevent the risk of overtraining happening?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, and you have to understand me correctly in my answer here. That I say to my guys, there's no such thing as overtraining. There is just undereating, undersleeping, doing too much in the program, and sort of, in terms, of course, there is such thing as overtraining, but my point to them is that if we're doing all of the small things well, they have very, very rigid mobility, flexibility programs. They have very, very strict eating structures, sleeping structures, et cetera, and touch wood, we've had lots of crashes where we've had broken collarbones and broken hands, etc. But in terms of pure overuse, sort of tendinitis, tendinopathy problems, we actually haven't had an overuse injury now for nearly 8 years. Since 2011 was the last time we had one.
For 8 years, that's really impressive.
With 25 athletes, and I put it the fact that we do the strength training, which keeps them strong, and we vary, and it's not sort of the same structural training. It varies very often. I think that's a big part of it.
I love that you've put so much emphasis on the important elements of recovery as well, that the sleep has to be right. They must eat right. They've got to get the balance between the training and the rest periods. Do you think that emphasis on real quality recovery makes a big difference in preventing the overuse?
It's everything, Ben. Honestly, it's I mean, we can feel it, we can see it, we can see it on the guys. I mean, honestly, just in their stiffness, just in their stiffness, we can see 3 or 4 days of hard training. I mean, the guys travel a lot, and they race all over Europe, so it's not uncommon for them to race Thursday in Belgium, Friday in Holland, Saturday in France, and Sunday in Italy, where they sort of are just finishing a race, literally, sometimes not even showering, literally just jumping in the car down to the hotel for the next day's racing. They're very, and those weekends, again, they're not injuries per se, but they come home on Sunday night and things are stiff, and the knees are sort of used and stiff, and so on and so on, and then Monday and Tuesday recovery day, stretching. By Wednesday they're okay again. So we have actually some sort of quite anecdotal but quite sort of good data there that is, we see it weekly with the guys that 2-3 days where they haven't slept well or haven't done their stretching or haven't followed their plan, and they feel it. We can see it in their numbers and in their watts, and it's quite live, and it's a chronic effect, but there's also an acute effect which we see almost instantly.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. That's fascinating. Now, like I said, we're coming up in time now. If you were to go back, not to the start of your career in the fitness industry, but if you were to go back to when you shifted into this space, the health sort of cycling, endurance space, and if you could give yourself one bit of key advice, what would you tell yourself?
Relax. Take it easy. I would. I think it's very, very easy to be sort of very outcome and goal focused, and I think when you think if you think back, and I can't remember many training sessions. I can't remember. You ask the guys, think back on your career. How many training sessions do you remember? It's very, very few times you remember today's training, and I think the guys get very stressed and anxious, and they forget to enjoy the process. They forget to be in love with what they do. They forget the love of the sport and why they do it. So I think I would go back and I would say, you've got more chance of winning if you relax. Where if you focus on winning, you sort of. I was very intense at the start, and I was very sort of hard and minute by minute and the structure. Where now, you know what, if we miss a little bit of training, or we're listening to our body, or we're calm, and really the sort of this part, the sort of the top 2 inches, having that in place, I think is more important than the killing themselves every single minute for one advantage. I still believe we should work hard, and some of my training sessions are horrific, but it's sort of seeing the bigger picture and being able to focus a little bit more on that rather than the pressure on today.
Yeah, and I can imagine, with cycling, especially if you're having a sport, as you said, you might have a Garmin that has 12 data points that you're tracking all the time. You could probably fall into the habit of being very tough on yourself because you're constantly watching for that data to be right.
Yeah. I mean, the psychological side of endurance sports is very unique, and they're sort of surround it off a little bit. We talked about the crossover between sports. Is if I can go back to being a rugby player, knowing what I know from the endurance world in terms of training. I mean, a classic example is we used to run 10 by 300 in pre-season with rugby, and it was the session I hated and feared the most. Where now 10 by 300 is we'll run 10 kilometers, do a 10 by 300, then run 10 kilometers, and just that pure psychology of 10 by 300 being nothing means that, being able to take that, to give that to rugby players or football players or sprint-based athletes, where you can say, look, volume, don't be frightened of volume, is a classic example of where the cycle would sort of meet again.
Mm-hmm. Hey Phil, it's been such a pleasure talking to you today, to see how you've used your background and your knowledge from multiple sporting disciplines and how you're feeding that into the one that you're passionate about now, and in cycling and triathlon and things like that. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. It's been such a pleasure.
It's great to see you again, Ben. I've missed you.
Thanks a lot, my friend. You have yourself a good day.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.